assembly, and it was so full of life. And keep that idea of life as we go into a more somber subject now. So there's always life. This is a reading from a sermon by Reverend John Burens, who was the 6th president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. For if there is an ought in forgiveness at all, it is no ought of obligation. It's an ought of opportunity. We ought to forgive in the way that we ought to lay down a heavy burden, in the way we ought to allow ourselves to accept a hug when we are lonely, a cool glass of water when we are thirsty. It comes like a miracle, like manna in the desert, like an angel in the empty tomb of the heart, by surprise, raising new life from death, breaking through the normal calculus of even-handedness and justice. And until we accept the deep truth that we all share this condition, we are trapped in pride and illusion. Only in humbly accepting that we share this condition, even with those who have wronged us, can we forgive others and allow ourselves to be forgiven. A reading from I Forgave My Son's Killer by Scarlett Lewis, a mother of Newtown, Connecticut. The next morning when I woke up, I began to say the prayer I say every morning, which starts by thanking God for all my blessings. That's when reality struck like electricity shooting through my body. Jesse. I had this out-of-control adrenaline feeling like right before a car accident, but it lasted for weeks. The sensation was so unbelievably horrifying that I felt as if I could disintegrate. I also felt a seething hatred for Adam Lanza, the man who murdered my son. At the same time, though, I knew that the force of hatred was the same emotion that contributed to Jesse's death and so many others. Deep down, I was aware that I had to get past my anger somehow in order to access my grief for Jesse. Over time, facts started coming out about Adam and his mother, Nancy. The pair lived alone in Newtown. Adam may have been bullied as a child, and he had emotional issues and was isolated. He reportedly hadn't spoken to his father in 2 years. Nancy, who was a single mom, found a common interest with her son in target shooting. She did this presumably as a way to bond with him. To my eyes, there was enough similarity between our lives and the Lances that I couldn't help but feel that we weren't much different. That gave me a base from which to work toward forgiving the Lances. To err is human, to forgive divine. A quote by English poet Alexander Pope from his poem, An Essay on Criticism, written in 1711. Pope's saying and extending the popular Latin saying of the time, errare humanum est, or to err is human, was showing that everyone is capable of making a mistake just because they are human, and should be worthy of forgiveness just as God forgives all through his divine mercy. Mr. Pope, excuse me while I extend your saying even more. To forgive divine. Many have supposed that that meant that the act of forgiveness is only to be attempted or practiced by one of a divine nature or a God or supreme being. So it's okay that we don't forgive because we're not gods. I want to argue that point, if you will indulge me for a moment. A saying ascribed to Jesus of Nazareth from the Gospel of Luke is, the kingdom of God is within you. If that vast realm is indeed within each one of us, does that not mean that we are divine ourselves? How else can the human heart, call it soul, higher self, oversoul, or whatever you want to call it, manage such a feat, hold such greatness? I'm not here to talk about your personal divinity, but rather to argue that if we are more than we seem in this earthly shell, then the work of such a being is indeed our work, and that is the work of forgiveness. Human beings over the course of history have committed every sort of atrocity, some even in the name of religion. And such heinous acts have been committed even against those whom reason would expect to be exempt from such acts, such as family members. There is no real reason in acts of violence, of course, whether the horrors are physical, emotional, or mental in nature. This is the true face of evil. To forgive such an act, no one would ever say it was easy. Some would even say that some things are unforgivable. I won't argue that, because I know it can seem impossibly hard. I do not believe, and I would never say, that such acts are to be forgiven, but forgiving the human beings who commit them, absolutely. The first principle of Unitarian Universalism is to respect the inherent worth and dignity of every person. If I truly embrace that as a you, then I must consider every person worthy of forgiveness as well. If they have worth as a human being, they are worthy of being forgiven. That worth, that faith that there's something good in them, some potential for transformation, that is what we believe in Unitarian Universalism. As a UU, I follow Taoism as my core philosophy. For me, the Tao is God, the universe, all the universes that ever were, everywhere, the all. Since we are part of the universe, we are part of God, or part of Tao, and hence that imbues everything with a divine within that is to be respected. If I am divine by nature, then every other human being also has a divine nature. If I do not respect their inherent worth and dignity, I'm not respecting myself. I am not one with the Tao because I am in denial of my own nature and theirs. But can we forgive? Let's stop for a minute to consider what the alternative is. What does it do to a human being to harbor unforgiveness toward a person? There's another phrase for this. It's called holding a grudge. There's a saying attributed to the Buddha which fits this. Holding in anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It takes a lot of energy to hold on to something as negative as a grudge. It requires attention, determination, and persistence, and it affects every aspect of one's life. To maintain negative energy like that in your person causes physical effects that affects your health. Scientists have identified health issues linked to the inability to forgive, like high blood pressure, muscle tension, increases in stress hormones, reduced immune system functioning, inflammation, even headaches and chronic pain, even chronic disease. That's the word disease, where the word disease comes from, a lack of ease. Something is interfering with your ease of life, with your natural flow of positive healing energy. This can happen even with when the other person has not done something unforgivable. It can happen in relationships when one person consistently does something that you don't like, such as interrupt you, borrow your car without asking, never pay you back. It can happen when someone else holds a political view that you strongly disagree with. When someone else talks behind your back at work or takes credit for something that you've done. It doesn't have to be murder. There's other ways to be stabbed in the back. When I shared a house with some other women when I was younger, I did not measure up to the standards of one of the women. I didn't realize that yet. Yet she never said anything to me, possibly for months after she had that opinion, until one day the top of her pressure cooker blew off. She yelled and screamed at me and did everything but throw things at me. I had had no warning of this, that I noticed that she had been upset with me for so long. She had been holding a grudge, nurturing it, keeping it alive, caring for it, until she could no longer contain it. This was someone who hated confrontation, yet she reached her boiling point. What must have been going on physically inside her to get her to the point where she could scream at me? I had never seen her get this angry. No one had. Did she have trouble sleeping at night? Surely her blood pressure was high. Did she feel sick? I'm glad she was finally able to get it out. In fact, we later became friends. Did I resent her for going off on me? Well, of course, my feelings were hurt. But I was able to admit that I could have worked harder at my chores around the house and what was expected of me. She did have a point. I didn't like getting screamed at, but she didn't hurt me, and I rather felt sympathy for her rather than getting so worked up that she, instead of expressing herself sooner in a more constructive manner. This is just one story, and it's a very small one. But there's stories and stories to be found on the transformational power of forgiveness. On the internet, I found a remarkable charitable organization in Great Britain called the Forgiveness Project, which seeks to promote awareness education on the healing and transformational properties of the act of forgiveness. The site holds many stories that dramatically tell how lives were changed after unspeakable tragedies, and how forgiveness changed all of those involved for the better. I could tell stories up here all day, but I will just read an excerpt from one. And I invite you later to go to theforgivenessproject.com to read more. There's many there. This is from Samantha Lawler from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, whose life was changed when domestic violence claimed the life of her mother at the hands of her father. For the next 13 years, I didn't have a good view of the world. My life was a muted, drunken blur. If people complained that they had bad relationships with their family, I had no tolerance whatsoever. I was consumed by a potent mix of grief and anger. Grief that I'd lost my mom, and anger with my dad for taking her away. I grieved, but because my parents had both been such amazing people who had instilled in me ways of coping, I was able to function. I went out, had relationships, and appeared to be my normal self. People would tell me it was good to cry sometimes. I would spend the whole afternoon crying, but it didn't help. As the years passed, it made no difference to the level of grief and hopelessness that I felt. Finally, when I was 32, I took a 3-day personal development workshop. There were 100 people in the group, and I could see how we all shared similar stories of fear, anger, jealousy, and despair. What I took from that course was a strong feeling of empathy and compassion toward humanity. I felt empowered. I made a list of all the people I turned my back on, and as I did so, I finally came across my dad. I was not expecting to work on that part of my life, but I realize now that my dad must also be dealing with anger, loss, and frustration. I immediately contacted the facility where he was incarcerated and found out they had been trying to get hold of me because my father was in a critical condition, quite literally on his deathbed. And so I set out to visit him. He was unrecognizable, a shell of his former self. He'd had multiple strokes and his muscles had atrophied. He was breathing from a tube, couldn't talk, and was handcuffed to the bed. But his eyes were open, and for all of that 10 minutes, he made eye contact with me. I was overwhelmed. So this is what judgment looked like. Suddenly, I realized he was doing what I'd always wanted, suffering terribly. The shock and the appalling state he was in cleaned the slate for me. I told him over and over how much I loved him and that I forgave him, and I apologized for waiting so long to come see him to tell him this. I realized later that during that 10 minutes, there were no feelings of hate or guilt or right or wrong. There was just a deep connection. No conservation was necessary, no apology. For 10 minutes, I got my dad back, and when I left, I felt this incredible weight leave me. I really have nothing to add to that. Crimes are committed, punishment is meted out, perpetrators are locked away from society. Justice has its day, though realistically and unfortunately, we know that sometimes it does not. But paying fines, going to prison, execution, even a heavy burden of guilt, none of those things work to repair a relationship, as Samantha learned. None of these go about healing a society damaged by 9/11 or the Rwanda genocides or various killing fields around the world. The change must happen within each one of us, where we honestly face the reality of the human condition and allow our divine within to be made more fully manifest. So how do we forgive? How is this accomplished? In 2006, the American Psychological Association prepared a paper sharing a sampling of researchable results on the topic of forgiveness as part of the United Nations workshop titled Forgiveness Partnering with the Enemy. 2 studies in this project presented methods for accomplishing forgiveness. The University of Wisconsin came up with a process model of 4 phases of forgiveness therapy. In brief, those phases are uncovering, which would be recognizing their anger, shame, and possibly their distorted thinking about the situation. Decision, making a conscious commitment to forgive the offender. Work, relinquishing anger as a psychological defense, choosing to fully experience the pain, and with the bearing of the pain, developing a sense of generosity toward the offending person. And deepening, acknowledging the vulnerability of the human condition, finding positive meaning in events previously viewed as mostly negative, releasing resentment, and even finding a new life purpose. This allows for the possibility of emotional regulation and a re-examination of the self as more than victim. Many of the stories from the Forgiveness Project detail how the person who comes to forgive finds that they are transformed their sense of being a victim to being a person of power, because they are able to move on and let go of their anger. Yet not from a position of superiority, but through an acknowledgement of the vulnerability in all of us. There's the saying, "There but for the grace of God goes I." Well, we could argue the dogma and the syntax of the saying, but I think you get the gist. We cannot truly know what it's like to have experienced all that another has been through to bring them to their condition of personal darkness. Stanford University also had their own forgiveness project detailed in the same paper. Their website is learningtoforgive.com. They came up with a 9-step forgiveness methodology. I'm not going to go through all the 9 steps. Don't worry. But this methodology concentrated more on the efforts of each person to take back their personal power, which had been stolen from them through the violence of the harm received. Recognition, articulation, choosing to move on, and to live a life with worth and hope. Accepting your personal responsibility for how you allow this experience to shape you. All these are important aspects. Stress management techniques are employed to assist. Meditation, art, music, using a mantra to help you keep perspective when your emotions threaten to overwhelm you. Only when you're able to handle yourself are you ready to approach the steps toward reconciliation and forgiveness. I'd like to share one more little story from the Forgiveness Project. Wilma Dirksen of Canada shared about losing her daughter to an unknown killer. The day her body was found, all our friends came to visit, bringing warm food with them. There was so much love in the house that helped us to get through. Then, at around 10:30 that evening, when most people had left, there was a knock on the door, and this stranger stood there. He told us, "I'm the parent of a murdered child, too." He was saying we now belong to an exclusive club that no one wants to belong to. We invited him to the kitchen table, and for the next 2 hours he told us in vivid detail everything he had lost. His health, his relationships, his concentration, his ability to work. He'd even lost all memory of his daughter because he could only now think of the murder, the trauma, and the hate that followed. Cliff and I went to bed that night horrified by the graphic picture he painted. Having just been through the pain of losing our daughter, it now seemed we might lose everything else as well. And so we made a decision that night that we would respond differently, and we chose the path of forgiveness. It is indeed a path, one I have chosen as a Taoist, a pagan, and a Unitarian Universalist. My divine within, the divine physician that guides me in maintaining my own mental, emotional, and spiritual health, has prescribed this attitude of life to deal with my own wounds and damaging experiences. I invite you to accept the prescription of your own divine physician as well. For our meditation, I have chosen Kuan Yin's prayer for the abuser. I did not write this, I wish I had. To those who withhold refuge, I cradle you in safety at the core of my being. To those that cause a child to cry out, I grant you the freedom to express your own choked agony. To those that inflict terror, I remind you that you shine with the purity of 1,000 suns. To those who would confine, suppress, or deny, I offer the limitless expanse of the sky. To those who need to cut, slash, or burn, I remind you of the invincibility of spring. To those who cling and grasp, I promise more abundance than you could ever hold on to. To those who vent their rage on small children, I return to you your deepest innocence. To those who must frighten into submission, I hold you in the bosom of your original mother. To those who cause agony to others, I give the gift of free-flowing tears. To those who deny another's right to be, I remind you that angels sang in celebration on the date of your birth. To those who see only division and separateness, I remind you that a part is born only by bisecting a whole. For those who have forgotten the tender mercy of a mother's embrace, I send a gentle breeze to caress your brow. To those who still feel somehow incomplete, I offer you the perfect sanctity of this moment. Please rise and join in our closing hymn, number 95, There is More Love Somewhere.